Okay, so now before I teach you how to read a paper, I need to teach you something even more important. Now you need to know what you're reading before you even start reading a paper, right? Now there's no one type of research paper, okay? There are many types of research papers. You need to know what you're reading. For now, there are three major types of paper you will encounter the most. So you will encounter original studies, expert narrative reviews, or systematic reviews or meta-analysis. Now, the problem is that if you read an original study, a review paper, and a meta-analysis the exact same way, it's actually a problem because it's like reading a recipe, a novel, and maybe your medical bills the same way. Now, they're completely different documents trying to do completely different things. So you can't read them the exact same way. So for that, you will first need to understand the three types. So firstly, we've got the original studies. Now this is where the researchers actually go out and do the study themselves, okay? They collect new data, and this data is collected from patients, it's collected from animals, cells, or experiments, and then they report what they found, okay? Now this data hasn't been presented before, right? So this is brand new evidence being created for the first time. As for the expert or the narrative review, this is basically an expert sitting down and writing a topic or explaining a topic using existing research. So they have to know something about the topic in order to explain it, right? So they are just summarizing and discussing what we already know in the field. They're not synthesizing anything new. Okay. Now, as for the third type is the systematic review or the meta-analysis. Now, this is a more structured version of a review. Okay. Now, instead of just picking studies to talk about, like in a narrative review or an expert review, they follow a strict search process that we actually talked about in our previous video. And they collect all the relevant studies and then they analyze them together in a meta-analysis. So even the numbers are statistically combined to give an overall result. Okay, so these are the three types of studies. Now that you know the types of studies, how do you identify what kind of paper we are holding, right? How can you identify if a study is an original study, an expert review, or a systematic review? The good news is you can actually figure that out in about 10 seconds or even less. And for that, you do not even have to read the entire abstract. So here's the trick. When you open the paper, so these are first of all, when you open a paper, okay, you go straight to the method section. Now, how would you find the method section? Because right now you don't even know the structure of a research paper. So what I want you to do is just go to the paper and look for a heading that's called methods. And when you open the heading, when you scroll down, you have to scroll down to find it, okay? So when you find it, what are you going to do? Well, once you find the method section, you are going to ask yourself a question. You're not going to read the entire thing, just a couple of lines, and you are going to ask yourself a question. And the question is, what is the subject of their methods? Now, for example, in an original study, the subject of the method section is patients, so humans, maybe animals, mostly mice, cells, and tissue samples maybe. And these are some of the statements or some of the phrases that are commonly used in the method section of an original study. So you can use them to identify your study, okay? An original study. So you are going to see phrases like we recruited, included, or enrolled, for example, 300 to 40 patients from this hospital or tertiary care hospital. There are also going to be statements about how the patients were or the participants were randomized, how the blood samples were collected. So you're going to see maybe mice is mentioned there if the study is about mice or animal tissue samples, cells even, or be conducted in RCD, something like that. So you would know that it's an original study. Okay, so that's how you're going to identify an original study using the method section, right? Now, as for the expert of the narrative review, in an expert and narrative review, when you scroll down to find the method section, well, firstly, you're going to find none. You're not going to find the method section. You're going to find headings, long headings, such as epidemiology, diagnosis, treatment options, and there are going to be statements like, this review discusses, or we provide an overview. These are very commonly used phrases in a review article. So you're going to look for them. And so the subject of your methods is going to be literally nothing, because there's no method section in the first place. Okay. And because this is an expert review, you just don't read it for the final verdict. You just read it to get an overview of the topic. Okay, so you do not, if you want to read it to find evidence on a topic, you do not read it. You read it just for an overview. You do not read it for the final verdict. Okay, so the third type of article, research article, is a systematic review or a meta-analysis. Now, when you scroll down to the method section of a systematic review and meta-analysis, you're going to again look for the subject. Now, the subject of a systematic review and meta-analysis is not human, is not animals, but the subject of a systematic review and meta-analysis are papers and databases such as PubMed, Embase, Scopus, Cochrane, and all of that. Okay, and even search strategies. So you're going to look for these terms in the method section. And there are going to be phrases such as we searched PubMed, Embase, and this. We included these many papers. Now, instead of patients, they are saying we included these many papers. So that's a sign that it's a systematic review and meta-analysis. Also, let's be honest, like in the older papers, maybe it wasn't mentioned in the title that it's a systematic review or a meta-analysis, but now it's mostly mentioned in the title. So you don't even have to scroll all the way to the method section to know that it's a systematic review. You can just read the title. And so here, it's databases and search terms. It's high quality and it's synthesized evidence. And there are going to be phrases such as studies were included, PRISMA guidelines were followed. And for systematic review, it's usually the most rigorous and the least biased summary available. Okay, so if we use our detective theme from our previous video to identify these papers, we can say that an original study is like a witness. As for the expert or narrative review, it's actually just an expert commentator, right? For systematic review and meta-analysis, as I described it earlier as the detective, because it's going through all the literature on a topic and then it's giving you a final or pooled answer or result. So that's why we call it the detective. So these are the three types of studies and how you identify them. Okay, so now that we have learned how to identify the different types of research papers, more specifically the three broad types, let's actually try and do that on a real research paper and try to identify it. Now, first thing first, when you open a research paper, you're going to scroll down and find a title or a heading called method section. Now, since I haven't already talked about the structure of a research paper, I just want you to scroll down and find a heading that says methods. Now, before even going there, it does say in the title that it's a systematic review and meta-analysis, but let's say it did not. Okay, for some older papers, it does not state that in the heading. So how are you going to identify it then? Then you're going to scroll down to the method section. So when you get to the method section, the first thing that you're trying to identify is the subject. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, first thing you're trying to identify is the subject of a research paper, of the method section specifically. So we are going to read the first two lines, not the entire thing, okay? Here, and we might read something here. So even in the first two lines, it says systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So you already know that it's a systematic review and meta-analysis. But since we're focusing on subject, let's actually try to find the subject of this. You see, they're talking about a total of 1375 papers, right? So you know that the subject of this method is not patients but papers, and even it states an inclusion criteria, for their systematic review. So you know that this and an exclusion criteria as well, and also search terms. And search term was a subject of a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So you already know this is a systematic review and meta-analysis without even reading the paper. Let's look at another study, okay? Here, now, you see here we have an abstract, so you don't really have to scroll down to the method section. So what you do is you see the method section here, and now you're trying to identify the subject. So if you just read the first line, pragmatic, randomized control. So if you knew a little bit about the types of original study, you would know that RCT is a type of original study. But again, since this video is for absolute beginners, I would want you to ignore this for now. In another video, I'm going to be talking about all the different types of original papers and how to identify them, okay? So you can just ignore them for now. We're just looking for the subject here, okay? So you see it mentioned patients here, participants. So again, what type of paper was participant and patients a subject of? Yes, original study. So this is an original study. It even said it in the title, a randomized control trial. So all the RCT, wherever you see an RCT or a randomized control trial written in the title, you should know that it's an original type of paper. Okay, let's look at another paper. Okay, let's look at this one. Again, we do have an abstract, so you don't really have to go scroll down to the method section. We have a method section here. So if you read the first line, it says 534 consecutive patients. So again, the subject is patients. They're talking about patients here because they're talking about enrolling patients. So you know that this is, again, an original paper without even reading the title. Okay, so let's look at one last paper. So let's scroll down. We do have an abstract, but you see this is called an unstructured abstract, where you do not have headings for your abstract. The type of papers where you have, or the type of abstracts where you have headings under your abstract, that's called a structured abstract, but this is an unstructured abstract. That's the only difference between the two. So we'll have to scroll down to find the method section because it's an unstructured abstract. You can't find the methods here, and I doubt it has a method section. This is a review paper, and I'll tell you how I identified that before even scrolling. You see, we've got long headings and no method section. I do not think this is an original study or systematic review, and I'll tell you why. So if you were to look at the title, because sometimes it's helpful to look at the title, you would see here it says review article, so you don't have to do all that work. So now that we have studied how to identify an original study, a research paper, let's actually study the structure of a standard research paper. Now most of the original research papers, they follow a format called a IMRD format. Okay, it's pretty standard. So in that format, A stands for abstract, I stands for introduction, M for methods, R for results, and D for discussion. And you need to follow this chronological order. You can't have discussion before you have the results, or methods before abstract. Now this is a simplified version, but there's also a more expanded version of it that I'm going to be teaching you today. I mean, there's no better version you can follow either, but I'm going to be teaching the expanded version because that one is actually in a bit more detail, and when you look at a real original research paper, you're going to find that more often as compared to this one. So let me show you. So here, this is the expanded version of the same format. So in this, we have included the title as well, because title is also important. And we've also included the conclusion, limitation, and references. Basically the extra parts as well. But they're just as important. Okay, so let's start with the title. So the first thing when you open a research paper is you're going to see the title, okay? Now this is the shortest part, but it's also the most important part for filtering your paper. So when you're screening, for example, for a meta-analysis, you do two types of screening in that, okay? You do a primary screening and secondary screening. We're going to talk about that in another video, just to let you know that you do screen just using the title and abstract as well. So title is very important in that case, right? Because it tells you what the study is about. The title sometimes tell you about the population that the study is about. It might also tell you about the topic, and sometimes even the study type. So I'll show you an example. Just give me a minute, okay? So let's open a study now. Okay, so this is a study from the New England Journal of Medicine. So when you first open the study, you are going to see, the first thing that you're going to see is the title. Okay, now let's go through the title first and let's see what does it tell us about the topic. Okay, so acute effects of coffee consumption on health among ambulatory adults. So first of all, it actually told me that coffee consumption is the intervention here. So they are testing coffee consumption. And what population? Ambulatory adults. That is their population. Okay, and what are they assessing? What is the outcome? There are health outcomes that they're assessing. We can actually check that out in more detail in the results section as well as in the abstract as well. But it did tell us a lot about the paper already. It did tell us what the intervention was and in what type of population they're checking or they're testing this intervention. So it's pretty informative, the title sometimes. Next thing on the list is abstract. Now, abstract is your 30-second overview of the entire study. It's like a summary of the entire paper. It's around 150 to somewhere around 300 words long, and it gives you a quick summary of the entire paper and what you should expect from the paper. Now, I told you before, just going to quickly explain that again. So there are two types of abstracts, an unstructured abstract and a structured abstract. Unstructured abstract is where you do not have headings under the abstract, and a structured abstract is where you have headings under the abstract. Let me show you. So let's look at this paper again, and if you look at it, this is the abstract, and we do have headings under the abstract. See? So what type of abstract would that make it? That is a structured abstract, right? So this is a structured abstract. Also, let's quickly check if this is an original study, right? So what did I tell you? What was the first thing that you need to check? You need to check the methods section. Let's see if we have, what is the subject of this methods? Let's check. We conducted a total of 100 adults. Now, adults is again humans, so their subject is human. And what type of study have humans as their subject? Well, yes, an original study. So we just confirmed that this is an original study. Pretty easy, right? Okay. Now, that was about the abstract. It just tells you what they studied, how they studied, what they found, and what it means. Just a quick overview of the entire paper. Next, we have the introduction. Now, this is where the authors answer one question. Why does this study even exist? Literally, that's what they answer in the introduction. They give you a background of the entire of the topic that they're studying, and they explain the problem in the introduction, as well as they state their objectives. Right? The author's job here is to convince you that there's a gap in the universe, and only their study can fill it. So it's a setup for their specific question. Let's actually look at it. So if you go, so this is now just below the abstract, you are going to find the introduction. Now it's just below the abstract and it's above the method section. So this is the introduction of this paper. Now in the first couple of lines, they are going to introduce their paper. Okay, they're going to give you a background of the topic. So if you're not very familiar with the topic, you should go through the first 2 or 3 lines, right? And in the last couple of lines, they actually state their objectives. So if you want to know what this study is about and what they're testing, what their objective is, you are going to find the answer in the last paragraph of the introduction. See, here they're stating that they conducted this to assess what? Their objective, right? So it's actually helpful if you want to know more about the paper, their objective, and what the topic is about. Okay, so that was the introduction. Now, the next part is the methods part. And this is where people usually get scared. But it's actually simple. It just answers, what did they do? I mean, who did they include in the study? How did they collect the data, and what tables, design they used, and what type of analysis they did? So how basically the study was conducted. Now just below the introduction section, you are going to find the methods section. Now I know it sounds scary, but it is not that scary. It's just about how did they conduct the study. So if this section is well written, someone else could replicate the study exactly. And it's the most boring part and the most important part for critical appraisal. So if you want to write a critique on a paper, you have to read the method section, because that's where you're going to get most of your points to criticize the paper. Okay, so that's the method section. It just includes all the details of how the study was conducted, all the statistical analysis and all that stuff, right? Okay, now below the method section, we have got the results section. Now it is a raw narration of what was found. Okay, in the results section, you never state your opinion. You do not have opinion in the results section. The figures and tables live here. It's just a verbal walkthrough of the data, and it should be dry. It should be objective. If there's interpretation here, that's actually a red flag. You do not have to interpret the paper in the results section. That's what discussion is for. So you just have to state what you found, numbers and all that stuff. See, here they have talked about the participants first. And in the results section, you're going to find table 1, maybe even above it. But table 1 is always mostly the baseline characteristics of the study in an original study. So it's basically a table where they give you the baseline characteristics of the population that they were testing the intervention in. So here they gave you the mean of their age, their gender, race, and everything, their baseline, all of their baseline characteristics, right? So it's very helpful if you're extracting data for your baseline table for meta-analysis. Okay, and also gives you outcomes, and all the numbers and figures live here basically. Now after the results section, we then have the discussion section. Now I told you that you can't interpret your results in the results section, and you have to interpret your results in the discussion. So discussion is basically the interpretation, and it's where you explain your results. You compare them to other studies, and you try to convince that your work matters, right? You actually compare it to previous studies in the literature and why your study differs, or why is it similar to the previous studies, right? The first paragraph of discussion usually summarizes the main findings, so the results, and the last paragraph is their final verdict, so the conclusion. I'll show you. So here, see, this is where they have stated their results. They're just going to restate their results here, right? And in the last paragraph, they're going to give you a conclusion. So your take-home message. If you don't remember anything from the paper, this is what they expect you to remember, right? And in the discussion section, they also have a limitation section where they explain the limitations of the study. And it's one of the most important parts of the paper, because the limitations tell you what the study could not do. So for example, they had small size, so they couldn't run some analysis. There might be some bias, some study designs issue. basically where you should not overtrust the results. And it's usually just above the conclusion, and sometimes there's a heading for the limitation section. But if you can't find it, see here. They've actually stated their limitations here. So you can actually read them and go through them. If they're hiding something, you can even write a critique on it. So that is the discussion part, and just below the discussion you're going to find the references. Now, this is where the authors show you every study they build their work on. So if you're doing research, this section is gold. If you're trying to find similar studies, you can also use the reference section. That's actually called the citation searching. And it shows you exactly where to go next if you're trying to find similar studies.